Hey everyone, it's Kirsten. Welcome to Season 3 of The Anthropocene.
The scene is set. You and your team have been walking for hours, doing your weekly round for the project, and you're tired. But trudging through bushy wetlands and mud boots, drenched in sweat and harassed by mosquitoes, is all going to be worth it when you check the next SD card. At least you hope it will be. You come around the familiar bend on the little deer trail and find your third camera trap. Carefully peeling the silicone away, you open it up and check the data. Wow, 100 photos. You have a long evening ahead checking these. You allow yourself to hope for a moment you will get the images you need, but quickly move on. Changing batteries, SD cards, checking that the camera is set, and heading out to the next one. You prep everything to head back out, but you take one step and stop dead. Rustling of the bushes causes you to wait and watch quietly ahead. Holding your breath, your heart is racing. There, you catch a glimpse of it. Pitch black, barely visible through the trees. It sees you and its yellow eyes meet yours for a split second before the slender black cat with tufted ears turns and runs through the bushes. That is definitely more than you could have ever hoped for today. You smile uncontrollably and continue to your last trap for the day, feeling blessed. Hello, people, and thank you so much for joining me of another episode of me talking to super cool people doing super cool biology. #wow, that's so cool. Anyway, today we are venturing into the mysterious world of cats. Not domestic cats, but oh boy, is that going to be quite the episode someday. I originally got Aidan on here to talk about his latest paper, which is extremely neat. And we're going to focus a bit on that. We're also going to chat about wildcats in general, how to bring them back to the landscape. But hang in there, calm your kitties, and let's get into it. So, Aidan, your paper was photographic documentation of melanism in bobcats in the Greater Everglades. Just to get started right off the bat, what is melanism for those who have never heard that term before?
So melanism is directly referring to the pigment known as melanin, and melanin is what creates the color black in nature. And melanism, again, you have, of course, we all have animals that we have a classic understanding of. Oh, that's a lion, it's this color, or a tiger, it's black and orange. But you, of course, have, as we know, across species, variants. We have variants in
Mm-hmm.
terms of how coat color is expressed, and we can have these variants where, just like albinism, where you can have a pitch white version of an animal, melanism can be thought of as the inverse, where you have hyper black like qualities expressed in both skin, fur, or even feathers. And so that was part of the novelty of really, setting the grounds for this paper, just because melanism is very rarely reported in bobcats, and
Right.
so it was a real unique opportunity to highlight, melanism in this species, but then also try and understand, okay, but why is it that the majority of sightings of melanistic bobcats seem to come from South Florida?
Okay, that's so interesting because I know for me, I had never heard of melanistic bobcats. So, I mean, you definitely get the Black Panther, which is like the black
Mm.
jaguars. I'm trying to think of some other examples, but when I saw that, I was like, "There's no way there's black bobcats. That is so cool."
And so that's an interesting thing, and this is something that I definitely want to bring up because a lot of people think that black panthers are an animal. They're
Hmm.
not.
Right.
I mean, again, go back 100 years ago before we really understood anything about genetics, and people would see these large, charismatic black cats and go, okay, yeah, there's jaguars, leopards, and then panthers because they
Hmm.
are, so morphologically different. But it wasn't until we actually started testing the genetics and going, oh, wait, this is just a really black jaguar, or this is a really black leopard.
Right.
And genetics really opened the doors in terms of us understanding, okay, yeah, this animal may be a different color from what it is normally, but it's still the same animal. And so, there was a paper that came out in 2019 by Greipel et al. And they actually highlight that of the 41 different species of cats, 14 of them can express melanism. But of
Okay.
course, the most famous are leopards and jaguars because, again, big
Mhm.
cats always get the most amount of attention out of people.
Right. Well, I think you get melanism in like foxes. I've definitely seen
Hmm.
that. And then on the opposite spectrum, kind of like we briefly mentioned, you get the like leucism, which is like the blondie white sort of guy. And we
Hmm.
have in Canada the spirit bears or the Commodity bears, they call them, which are like the white and black bears. So it's kind of the opposite of like the whitish bobcats, the black bobcats, and you get the black bears that are actually white. So really neat.
No, it is. It's interesting stuff, and also trying to understand how does this rare thing continue to persist? Because there would be expectations, at least for and part of we go into this with the paper. There's expectations that if you're a predator, being
Hmm.
having black fur could be really beneficial in low light environments, as you would expect, as that can help a jaguar or a leopard if they're in a place that has a lot of canopy cover.
Right. So kind of along that line, I mean, that's a little bit more like the ecological why behind it, but we have a Patreon question alert. Whoop whoop. This is our very first Patreon question ever for the podcast. Very exciting. This one's coming from Rob Nelson, and he said that I want to know exactly what we know about the genes calling melanism, leucistic traits, and albinism. I know they're all somewhat different, but I get asked this all the time. What exactly is the mutation? Has anyone studied this? Do you have some ideas?
So, first of all, I am not a geneticist. That is not my background. I would definitely put myself more in the spatial ecologist school of thought. But with
Hmm.
that being said, I of course did my homework when trying to understand the factors that really determine melanism across species. And so there's two primary genes, at least specifically to melanism, that scientists have identified that really seem to be the biological mechanism that's driving
Hmm.
these phenotypes. And so first you have the ACIP gene, also known as the agouti signaling protein gene, and then you also have the MC1R gene. Now these are two different. And it's actually interesting because there's these two different genes expressed differently, and I'll
Okay.
give an example with leopards and jaguars since we've been talking about them already. So, for example, melanism in leopards is actually a recessively inherited trait.
Okay.
So it's a recessive mutation that occurs on the ACIP gene for leopards. And so, just again, when you have run of the mill, you have mama leopard and you have papa leopard, and they have a baby. If they both have the recessive traits and the mutation, it can lead to this expression. And
Hmm.
then, however, juxtapose that to the MC1R gene, it's actually a dominant trait,
Oh,
which is
wild.
observed in jaguars. And so it can lead to a gain of function mutation, and it's favored particularly. And again, and this is the interesting when you actually look at a melanistic jaguar or leopard and you highlight with a light along the coat, you still see the spots. The
Right.
animal, the spots don't go away, but the melanin, again, because there's of course melanism in the original coat color in the spots. It's just hyper expressed across the pelage. And what's
Hmm.
really interesting is this is also these mutations with both these genes are also observed in many cats that are in the Leopardus lineage of cats. And so the Leopardus lineage are the small spotted cats that you observe in Central and South America. And so this includes ocelots, margays, etc. But the genetic, what has been observed in terms of the genetic mechanisms within these small cats is with cod, pampas cat, and Joffrey's cat. All of the melanistic morphs of these tiny cats are associated with all these different mutations of these genes to a certain extent or the other.
Okay. That's really interesting because I know that MC1R is like largely responsible across a bunch of different animals, which is really interesting. And I just want to like quickly jut into because I mean, talking about how complicated genetics is, I think it's just easy to give people like something to compare it to. So, like the first one that you're saying is a recessive gene in people would be like blue eyes. So blue eyes is like
Precisely.
recessive. Yeah. So like mom and dad both have to have like the blue eye allele on that gene to be able to give it to you. And then the MC1R would be like brown eyes, where that's like the dominant gene and it's more likely that you get that than the blue eyes. But that's so interesting that it seems to just be these two genes across so many different mammal species.
Oh, it's the same, again, jumping from felids to canids. This is also a phenomena observed in wolves, where,
Right.
a lot of, we often, it's called a gray wolf, but in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the genetics of coat color, melanistic wolves are actually can be quite common
Uh-huh.
because of how the mechanisms of these mutations express in populations, which it gets really interesting in understanding, okay, we're getting the same phenotype here, but they're operating on two different mechanisms, which I think that is fascinating, but definitely not my usual wheelhouse of study.
Right. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to look into that so that we had an idea. That's so great. So then what was the main reason your team decided to pursue this research? I know you kind of mentioned that, melanistic bobcats were mostly showing up in Florida, but what was the hook for you guys?
So this is I'll tell you the story. So it's a
Okay.
fun story. So my advisor in grad school at Texas A&M Kingsville, he runs the Patton Center for Deer Research. He's a deer biologist. So
Mhm.
I'm a cat guy, but I was trained by one of the prey or deer school of thought. And so when he was originally based out of University of Georgia, Athens, he at the time got on a massive grant and opportunity to really study the predator-prey dynamics of South Florida. And it's a really unique environment, Southern Florida, because it's subtropical. It has one of the shortest fire return intervals in the U.S. It's smashed by hurricanes, but you also have the opportunity to really understand how, with Florida panther, which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service identifies as a subspecies of mountain lion, is currently recovering
Mhm.
in that part of the state. So, and they have increased to a certain extent, and there's still, speaking of genetics, there are still certain genetic issues with Florida panther, but because they have increased in numbers, there's a real strong interest to understand, okay, now we have this large apex predator recolonizing the swamplands. How is that impacting native deer populations? And
Mhm.
so, in order to answer some of these broad scale questions, as much as I love getting hands on either a deer or a large cat, most of these questions are best answered using large camera trapper arrays where you can get long-term data with very small amount of financial investment. And so inadvertently, again, no at the time, no one imagined that we were going to get melanistic bobcats on camera. That was just, we knew, everyone knows that in southern Florida, and this is reflected in literature, consistently publications come out about melanism and bobcats and people just seeing them, but no one had ever produced a photo of a melanistic bobcat in their natural environment. There's tons of photos of them in trapping records. There's people posing with bobcats that they shot, and also just random. Oh, here's some GPS location of a melanistic bobcat that I saw, but no photo. Which I always kind of scratch my head. How do you get that through peer review? We're just saying GPS locations of what I claim I saw. So, anyways, what happened was, they were going through all the data, and they're of course categorizing everything, but then all of a sudden, over the course of, I want to say the first photo was in 2015, but over the course of 2 years, we got over 25 detections of a melanistic bobcat. And
Okay.
so it's, and in time, and again, nor I say of singular bobcat, because if you look at the spatial array of where this animal was detected, it likely represents the home range of a single individual, but across its life, which is super cool, because then some of the photos you see the bobcat kitten super small, pitch black, he's walking around with mom, but then a year later he's full grown, he's dispersed, he's moving on his own, And so it became one of those things that my advisor, really pitched that this is a real cool natural history observation because, there's tons of like cell phone camera or grainy pixelated things on Facebook and social media going, oh, it's a black bobcat, but it's again not a crystal clear photo until
Mm-hmm.
he inherited this gold mine from this massive camera trapping effort to study Florida panther and white-tailed deer dynamics, that he was like, Aiden, do you want to write up a short note for me and let's get at the roots? And, again, it's one of those things that, and we talk about this also in the paper, and that we can't empirically prove anything with this. This is a natural history observation, but we offer hypotheses as to why this observation is unique, but why is it that southern Florida really does support this phenotype of bobcats more so than it seems anywhere else in the United States or in Mexico.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, so it was a fun journey, and it really, I never imagined getting into talking about polymorphism in wildlife. I mean, I read a bunch of papers, even in the bird literature, talking about how melanism works across birds, and it became, again, a fascinating ecological kind of pathway that prior to that point I never really thought of. Just as because as I said, spatial ecology is where I primarily focus, is understanding space use of any given
Mm-hmm.
species in time.
Right. You never know where the biology will take you, that's for sure.
You really don't, and I was delighted to be able to help put this out in the spotlight.
Right. Well, and I think this is so crucial because this is something that I like to come around to quite often is we're just kind of like missing now this like natural history piece in the literature because everybody wants these like super like quote unquote high impact like really interesting papers that have to be these like groundbreaking genetics or like and all these things are important, but I feel like we're missing these little pieces of like, hey, this animal's here and it does this thing and it eats this thing. Like I remember working in the world of arthropods, like I would come across all these ant species that we had like all the taxonomy for, and I had this one and I couldn't find like what their niche was, like what they ate, because a bunch of ants are predators or they're just scavengers. And I ended up actually getting a hold of like the expert in this ant, and I was like, what do they eat? And he's like, nobody knows. And I was like, why does nobody know? And it's because no one takes the time to do that anymore. So
And that's the thing that it just even reflects in the literature, because I'm like, okay, yeah, jaguars, they're getting attention. Leopards,
mhm.
they're getting attention. Hell, even all the small cats in South America between Joffrey's cat, Codicod, and Pampas cat are getting attention. But you're telling me the most abundant wild cat in North America, and no one has ever really tried to understand the molecular ecology of why this is a thing. And
Right.
and this is something that I really deal with, these, as we were talking earlier about black panthers. I often am fascinated by the folklore, because I often think it's kind of the fisherman. I think it's the fisherman effect, because this is something that most people don't know. So remember, for the recall, if we were, excuse me, as we were talking about earlier, there's only 14 species of wildcat that are confirmed to express melanism. Do you know
Mhm.
which one of them it's definitely not
Definitely not
melanistic?
tigers.
They have a hyper expressive
Okay.
version
All
of
right. All
stripes, but
right.
it's one that you can find in the US.
Oh, you can find it in the US. Pumas.
Yeah. And that's the
Okay.
thing, is
Yeah.
despite everyone, I mean, you would have a field day going on Facebook and type in the Texas Black Panther page, and everyone claiming that I saw a Black Panther on my ranch. Oh my God, they're here. But
Okay.
again, there is, to my knowledge, after doing a deep literature dive and even into museum specimens, there's of course different coat variants of
Mhm.
puma across their
Mhm.
range, but there are no black variants of puma, and which I think is fascinating. But part of me wonders, at least from the folklore side of it, is that really a fact of I saw a black cat and it was this big? Just like no, again, like just how fishermen tell the story of, oh, I caught this massive trout. It was
Mhm.
huge, and you hold out your arms, and that, we in the moment may see, oh, what's that mysterious creature? Oh, it looks like a cat. Oh, but we got to have an interesting story. It was a huge cat. It wasn't a tiny little bobcat, and I think that is I often wonder if that's the reason why the myth of the Black Panther, particularly in the Southeast and the United States, it still persists because of these random one-off observations of a true melanistic wildcat. It's just not the one that people want it to be because it
Right,
doesn't make it as
right.
an interesting story.
Oh, for sure. Well, and also there's probably like a little bit that people don't know that bobcats can be black, but everyone knows that there's black panthers. So maybe there's like a bit of that. But I definitely think, yeah, like you said, the sort of the fisherman effect probably has something to do with that.
Yeah, no, and that's something that the intersectionality between natural history and myth and folklore is a it's a wormhole because you can get lost down it trying to understand how people try to make sense of the world in real time.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's one of those things that there has to be course corrections, or else
Yeah.
people get lost in the culture of it as opposed to what reality often is.
Right.
As
And
as
if
much
people
as
would have, sorry, go ahead.
I was about to say, as much as I love magic just as much as everyone else, and I love the idea of the mystical Black Panther wandering the southeastern part of the US, it just, again, scientifically, it's not demonstrated.
Right, right. Yeah, so it's hard to say. And I think if people have, a better education of what's around them, they can also help scientists understand better because if they said, "Oh, for sure I saw a black bobcat," then that would help add at least to maybe you couldn't use it as a scientific data point, but you would set up a camera trap or something there instead of people just kind of going off with these stories. Yeah.
Well, it's one of those things, and again, I'm not much of a carnivore hunter myself, but the fact that no one from all these people who, are posing with
Hmm.
these melanistic bobcats that they've hunted, I'm surprised that no one has been able to collect tissue samples off of any of them to really go,
Right.
okay, we
Mhm.
have a hard tissue sample. Let's really get into the genetic side of this interesting phenotype. But to this day, no one in my knowledge, has been able to do that.
Right. Well, I guess that's something up next then for the next challenge for someone to look into.
Perhaps.
So then no questions asked, like these black bobcats are hella cute. If y'all are listening, go check out the photos. I think you have some on your Instagram,
I
maybe.
do.
Yeah. Yes. So definitely do that. But then based on the hypotheses that you came up with, what are some of the ideas of why these black bobcats do persist in the area? What did you come up with for that?
So there's two different hypotheses that we really offer, and it comes to both disturbance regime and also ecobiographical rules. So
Hmm.
one such rule, have you ever heard of Bergman's rule?
Probably, but I forget what it is. So,
So Bergman's rule, and I'm just offering this as an example. Bergman's rule states that within a species distribution, as it gets closer to the poles, body mass increases. And
hmm.
sticking to bobcats as an example, and this is it's really cool to see this rule play out. Is when I was in South Texas doing my master's, my biggest tom that I had
Hmm.
during my study that I collared was 19 pounds.
Okay.
So teeny tiny, but
Yeah, little baby.
meanwhile, bobcats up and the Canada, US border, you can get 40, 45 pound bobcats just normally. And
Right.
so a lot of that rule comes down to, okay, yeah, if you're living in a colder climate, you need to have more resources to maintain a body size to stay warm in. And
Hmm.
and this is interesting beyond just body mass, but also just space use. Because again, some of my bobcats in Texas, they were living in an area less than the size of a football field. They are living
Oh,
in
okay.
home ranges of like 2 square kilometers. But meanwhile, if you're studying a tom up in, again, Canada, US borderlands, you can have a tom that has 120 square kilometers. And so you get these and it's really fascinating because it's not just observed in bobcats, but it's across taxa, and that's where these rules really come into play. But coming back to melanism,
Mm-hmm.
there's another rule, and it's called Glauger's rule, and it postulates that instead of the poles, as you get closer to the equator, melanin production in skin, fur, feathers increases, particularly in tropical and humid environments.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is well documented, as we have talked quite frequently about jaguars and leopards and a lot of these other South American wildcats. It's also described a lot in birds, and it's even been observed in some species of rodent as well. And so
Okay.
Glauger's rule is the one part because southern Florida, it is a subtropical environment, particularly in the swamplands. And you can imagine, while it's not a rainforest in the Amazon or a a excuse me, a dense rainforest in the Amazon, it's still a dense, humid swampland. So there's
Right.
still tons of shadow, tons of cover. That, again, if you're a melanistic predator, that could be of benefit to you as a cat. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
other side of the equation, talking about disturbance regime, is that Florida has the shortest fire return interval in the US. We talk about a lot about, like, say, serotinous cones in western
Mm-hmm.
forests, where you have to have fire in those systems to get those cones to release their seeds. These plant communities in South Florida are pyrophilic. They need to burn frequently in order to survive and propagate. And one of the kind of broad ecological processes that's been observed associated with fire and even lava is fire and lava melanism, where you
Right.
have animals that can blend into these fire scars or lava scars and camouflage in these darker environments that are created by the disturbance regime. And this has been observed in insects, and this has been observed in also other species of rodent as well. And so, with these two different broad ecological processes involved, we hypothesize that this is likely what could contribute ecologically to why melanism is so frequently observed in this environment when you combine Glauger's rule with an environment that is burning so much.
Right. Right, that's really cool. Yeah. So you get melanism in different populations, but for it to be able to maintain itself, there's got to be usually some ecological reason. So you're getting really dark forests and you're getting black burned landscapes, which makes it good to be nice and dark.
It does, especially Crypsis is one of those things that really is driven by how well you can blend into your environment.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that if melanism may not always be beneficial, like say if you're on a white sandy beach, you're gonna
Mhm.
stick out like a sore thumb. And so when the environment creates these novelties where normally, okay, yeah, you wouldn't find anything out there, if it can benefit you hiding yourself from your desired prey or hiding yourself from other predators, animals are going to be able to exploit that as a resource.
That's cool. Yeah, another example that always comes to mind is if you ever go to the Galapagos, there's like lava rock everywhere. So you get like the marine iguanas are like pitch black, and the Sally crabs when they're babies are like these little black guys, and you can't see them at all when they're in the lava rock. So it's got to be something similar to that. That's really neat.
Yeah, no, it was, and it's one of those things that no one, and while melanism has been observed in both fox squirrels and coyotes
Hmm.
in Florida, there still seems to be a general lacking of research effort to really understand definitively what drives this, or even just as we've talked about earlier about just the mutation side of, is this a dominant or recessive thing? And my money would be recessive, because
Mm-hmm.
we had over 10,000 detections of bobcats in these camera grids, but less than 1% of those photos yielded a melanistic variety, which you would hypothetically think that, okay, yeah, this is a dark swampland environment. If I'm pitch
Mm-hmm.
black, I'm gonna kill it in terms of increasing my own fitness. But yet we still, despite having a wide camera array, we still only detected them in one of the grids and in a very small portion of the grids in and of themselves. So beyond beyond just confirming the genetic component, overlaying that with these broader ecological principles, I think is definitely needed to really understand what's going on here.
Right. Lots of work to be done still.
Mhm.
So along that lines, then talking about camera trap work, I'd love to just talk a little bit about that. I don't think people realize how much goddamn work camera trapping is. I don't know if you were involved directly with this camera trap results, but I know you've done it before. So can you tell us a bit about what camera trap research looks like?
Yeah, so as I said, this was a kind of more of a side project for me.
Mm-hmm.
The work that was done was handled by Dr. Heather Abernathy and Dr. Daniel Crawford, both former lab mates of mine who I miss very dearly. But yeah, for my master's thesis, I did my own camera grid, studying kind of how the thermal environment and landscape structure really influences carnivore community activity in South Texas landscapes.
Okay.
And camera trap data is beautiful. It is, in my opinion, the most versatile form of ecological information that you can use to study wildlife, because you have a location, you have a time of when the photo was taken, and you can use that to build so many different kinds of models, whether you're trying to estimate density, occupancy, trying to understand interspecific interactions, if you're trying to model circadian rhythms. Like, there's so much modeling potential just using remote trail cameras, which is great. On the other hand, it can often get very messy in terms of data management and containment, because, for example, for my camera trap study alone, I processed by myself 2 million photos for
Yeah.
my master's degree. And again, for anyone who does carnivore work, and most people will know this, is at least in the carnivore space, you need to usually have years of data in order to get the type of ecological patterns that you're trying to observe, just because there aren't, with, especially at that trophic level, there aren't as many predators as there are prey. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to really dial in, and if you're especially studying endangered carnivores, you need even more time to actually capture the data necessary to really represent what your pattern of interest is, or what your species of interest is. And so this is the nice thing. I mean, again, the horrors of AI definitely pose many threats to artists and such. But from a data analytic perspective, AI is amazing, where you can submit, and there's a program known as Wildlife Insights, where you can submit camera trap data, and in real time the AI model will sift through all your photos, tag them with a date and a time, and it will do its best job to identify what the species is. And this, and for a lot of these algorithms, it really is only as good as the data that is trained on. So Wildlife Insights, as I've experienced, is very good with a bobcat, because
Mm-hmm.
everyone who's submitting data in the US is submitting bobcat data. So it's like, oh yeah, that's a bobcat, 95% confidence interval, or with a 95% confidence. And so AI really can help cut down on those data processing issues, because it is an issue that everyone in the wildlife field deals with is just sitting down and saying, okay, is that it? Is that it? And most of my time during my masters was just by month was just sorting through all the photos. And and let me emphasize, 2 million total photos. How many of those photos do you think actually had animals in them?
Oh, I'd go like 10%, maybe a little higher.
17,000
Okay.
of 2
Yeah.
million. So real rough.
Yeah. Brutal.
Real rough, particularly when you've got vegetation tripping up cameras or other things that trigger. Don't get me even started on cows triggering my
Oh God.
cameras. They are the worst.
Yeah.
It's in their nature to mess with the trail camera if they see it. And so, yeah, and that's where, at least again, coming out of my master's degree, while everyone loves the sex appeal of going out and catching a rare carnivore and putting a GPS collar on it to study its movement, if you're really trying to get, at least in terms of cost per unit effort, uh, data quality, I would give it to cameras.
Right.
Because if you put enough cameras out there, not only can you likely get at your specific question, but people who come after you can use that data in a completely different way. And that's, I think,
Right.
the
Hmm.
benefit of doing camera trap studies to collaring efforts. Which, don't get me wrong, I love collaring efforts, and there's my first chapter of my thesis was all about using GPS collars, but there are always, as I'm sure you are very well aware, pros and cons of scientific methods and
Right.
what the
Hmm.
ultimate net benefit or net con will be if we go a certain route.
Right. Well, and like you're talking about too, in terms of collaboration, I mean, if you're studying one species and somebody else is working with something else and you're getting that data on your camera trap, like that's something that can be shared and worked on, a whole bunch of different groups by just using exactly like one piece of equipment. And it's a huge amount of man hours going through them. And even also too, especially if you're using really remote locations, like hiking to and from those spots
Mm-hmm.
to go to the camera trap and changing out the cards and checking the batteries. And sometimes things go wrong, but it's such a really amazing tool. And the cameras get better all the time. Like I remember, it's amazing if you look at like camera traps from like, I don't know, like not, I wouldn't even say 10 years ago, probably 5 years ago, like the quality of image you get. And now you're getting like essentially like DSLR like quality from the camera traps that you're putting out. So that's really cool.
It is, and in terms of, at least just in my experience, I mean, scientists aren't necessarily putting out the SLR rigs,
Hmm.
just because those are you.
Yeah.
If you're putting out the remote SLR rig, you're going for, I want a specific shot of this animal
Yeah.
walking through this place here, and so for many of scientists, it's all about, okay, here's a good model. Does it have a good sensor? Is it going to
Hmm.
accurately get everything I need, and then we're good to go? But yeah, if we're comparing models to say like the early 2000s, it is night and day difference in terms of what cameras can do now as opposed to what they did in the early 2000s. It's truly amazing because I've seen some of these cameras and I'm like, people actually got data off of these, like
Right.
actual usable data, because I'm like, do I need to like get a film canister process too? Like I was really scratching my head of how did early camera trapping, at least studies, work given the extreme limitations of where the technology was at the time. But just like how the first GPS collar, do you know what they powered the first GPS collar with?
I do not.
A car battery.
Oh, God.
Do you know what they put it on?
Something that shouldn't have had a car battery on it, I'm assuming.
It was an elephant.
Oh,
So
okay.
an
Okay.
elephant can take a car battery, but what's amazing is that again, you had that in the 80s where you had these massive honking collars and they're like,
Oh,
well,
no.
you can't really put this on really any animals unless it's like an
No.
elephant-sized critter, and even then we don't really want to have a car battery on an elephant. But yet
Hmm.
now collars have got so small and sophisticated that they even make mice collars now.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that's the beauty of progressive technology, is that, at one point, yeah, these are really our limitations here about what we can do with it, but give it enough time, refinement, battery type concerns, we can eventually fit the technology to the specific thing that we want to study, which is really exciting to see, especially. And I just use the GPS collar as an extreme example because it's
Mhm.
wild to think of where we started to where we are today. And hopefully, I'm hoping one day GPS collaring could just be just a injectable in the back of the animal, so you don't even
Right.
need a collar at that point. It's just something subdermal that's taking points as the animal's moving throughout the day, and it's not invasive.
Yeah.
Because there's always the whole ethical side of putting out collars on animals and making sure that we're not inhibiting their life or making it more difficult. But as collar technology gets better and more refined, I think we're going to see things only get smaller and smaller, just as we've seen camera traps become more refined and refined to, some of the animal wildlife photographer of the year shots. They're all on camera trap rigs,
Mhm.
which is wild to think about, because we often think about, oh, what does it take to be a Nat Geo wildlife photographer? We often think that means, oh, you have to hold the lens and be there at the right shot. But so many of them are just like painters. They're like, okay, this is my canvas, this is my scene. The animal walks here, right here, and boom,
Yeah.
you have all the things that you need, and you don't even have to be there to get it. And it allows for those opportunities, because there are some animals that are really cryptic, and you're
Mhm.
not going to be able to get a great shot of them if you're there.
Right. Well, and it makes it so much less invasive as well, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
That it
Well,
does.
that's incredible. I loved hearing just about what led to that research and that really interesting note. For everyone, you'll know that it's linked in the show notes, so go do check that out for sure. But let's go just a little broader into the rest of cats of kind of North America, southern North America. So people may or may not have known that bobcats were a thing that are there, but what other big cats are found in the regions that you studied?
So this is the wild thing about, at least in the U.S. Texas at one point had the highest cat diversity in the U.S. And
Mm,
so we, of course, have bobcats. We also have populations of puma. We also have had jaguars, and then we also had jaguarundi, and then we also had margay. And
okay.
then who am I? Wait, hold on. I have to make sure I'm not forgetting anybody. Bobcat, puma, jaguar, ocelot, margay. I don't think I'm forgetting anybody. Did
I
I
think you
did I
didn't
say?
say ocelot the first time. I think that's what we're
Oh,
missing. Yeah.
how could I forget ocelot? Oh my god.
The
uh,
betrayal.
the betrayal is so real. But yeah, so you know, Texas used to be a really catty place, and with the
Mhm.
only other cat that's missing from North America is Canada lynx, and you only really see that in the rural West or in up in Canada. And so the southern extent of North America, you do have a really large cat guild, so to speak. And unfortunately, over the past 100 years, Texas, we now only have bobcats, endangered populations of ocelot, and very limited populations of mountain lions. We don't really know much about pumas or mountain lions. They're the same species
Mhm.
in Texas, in terms of what their populations are doing.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we used to have a lot more. I mean, unfortunately, this is a story across a lot of our world where we're seeing like the depletion in this. But what is some of the general relationship then between big cats and people, the ones that are left?
So, I mean, you can imagine this is the same story that gets played out time and time again.
Hmm.
And this goes back to, even like, we talked about myth and folklore. Large predators and human beings, we've always had an antagonistic relationship with one another, whether it's looking at wolves, whether it's looking at grizzly bears or polar
Hmm.
bears, and this even gets extended into the world of cats, particularly jaguars and pumas, since they are the largest of the cats that can be found in North America. All the other cats are small cats. But in terms of overall relations, I mean, I think in the modern sense, and even if you look even at the colonial sense, it's all really associated with profit. And that,
Mm-hmm.
we would set up these massive ranching operations, or we set up a massive agricultural enterprise, and then, here come predators that, they don't know any better, and they see an easy meal, and they're going to exploit that resource, and then that inadvertently hits people in the pocketbook, which makes people retaliatory. There were, of course, in the early parts of the 20th century, mass poisoning efforts, bounty systems, and that really, you know, was what led to a lot of carnivore populations, across North America to really crash. Is just
Yeah.
this not only, again, physical threat, because again there is something intimidating about a large predator, as anyone really should feel that way, because again, it's something that could hurt you. But I think the big thing was really just trying to limit, what is this going to do to my profit if I'm, having a livestock operation. And the last Texan jaguar was actually shot right outside of where I went to school in South Texas, at Texas A&M Kingsville, and it was shot in 1948. And
Wow.
it's an amazing photo, because it really highlights, just kind of a just different culture of time. You see this bloodied jaguar being held up by like a 6-year-old kid on someone's front lawn.
Right.
So it just, it highlights an era in history that, you really hope never gets repeated, because, we've lost such biodiversity, and we've lost so many spaces for our carnivores that are a part of these ecosystems, but just have declined so substantially. And, there's lots of things that I really think there are, doom and gloom type of conversation, but there are rays of
Mm-hmm.
hope. So there was
Yeah.
a couple of papers that came out from Mexico, by Caballos et al. In 2021, that actually took, 10 years of camera trap data in Mexico, and found that jaguar numbers have actually increased in Mexico over the past decade. And this
Right.
is in part due to local led conservation initiatives, really helping, keep, jaguars breeding. But the big component in that is also trying to find ways of, okay, how do we mitigate human carnivore conflict? Because, one of the things that, a lot of folks, particularly in state governments, can look to is going, okay, we know that, jaguars, or replace it with wolves, or replace it with any carnivore, are going to take your livestock. It's just nature of the beast. Once they learn that that's an easy meal, okay, how about if we financially compensate you, or financially provide the materials that you need to help make sure that X, Y, or Z predator doesn't get in with your livestock animals? And, when you do that, it can sometimes, from at least a psychological perspective, it can help people feel like, okay, I don't have to take matters into my own hands, and it makes
Mm-hmm.
people less likely to do especially if we're talking about endangered carnivores, less likely to do the shoot, shovel, and shut up scenario, which is what nobody wants that to happen. But, this, of course, is a reality, and it happens all the time.
Right.
And so, really, and I think where a lot of this starts is, and I think a lot about the whole Colorado wolf thing, because, on paper, I love it. I love trying to reintroduce carnivores back into their former ranges where they were originally extirpated. But on the other hand, uh, where you kind of draw issue is that there isn't an aspect of listening in there,
Right.
because the people that voted to reintroduce wolves back into Colorado aren't necessarily the people who are going to have to live with wolves in their backyards or what have you. So, the people of Denver, Boulder, they like, oh yeah, magically love the idea of having wolves back in Colorado, but they don't have to bear any of the financial consequences of now, okay, now crap, there's wolves by my ranch and there didn't used to be. So I
Mm-hmm.
think a big component is really, when you have those situations, is trying to hear the other side and understand where of course, their concerns are, and doing to the best of your ability to address those concerns. And you're not in the business of carnivore conflict. There are some people you're never going to please. It's
Yeah.
so much of it is customer service, and with some folks, it doesn't matter if you give them $200,000, like, here you go, is this enough? Some things will never be enough. But if you can at least try and turn the tide and make people realize that, oh, okay, yeah, this animal is on the landscape, it can do these things, but it's not a direct threat to my daily life or my monetary stability. I mean, one of my favorite books I read, I think it's called Down from the Mountaintop, was about grizzly bears in Montana. And so say you're a small corn grower, and you have in you're not one of those Monsanto large operations. You just have your row of cornfields, and then you have your apple orchards. If a grizzly bear gets on your property because it's going through hyperphagia, there's documented cases of a single bear doing $10,000 worth of damage to a person's crops
Oh
in
boy.
one day. So, if you're, especially if you're, one of these small time farmers or small time ranchers, these are
Mm-hmm.
real numbers. These are real heavy hitting numbers. And so, the big part of trying to address, at least, and trying to improve relations with large predators, whether you're talking about bears or you're talking about wild cats, is trying to hear people out and understand, okay, where you have this fear and you have this potential problem. What, from whether we're talking from a agency or an NGO perspective, can we do to mitigate things that could potentially happen?
Right.
So I think it really, those conversations really begin there. And with and this is the thing that also scares me, when I look at California. What we saw with Colorado is that, people got really hyped up of bring back the wolves to Colorado, and I know people in the state of California who are looking at grizzly bears. Do you know much about California grizzly?
Just that they were eradicated or like extirpated like a really long time ago, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. So,
Yeah.
the last California grizzly was shot, I want to say 1924.
Okay. Yeah, very long
State,
time ago.
very
Mm-hmm.
long time ago, state flag, and there are lots of folks who romanticize the idea of bringing grizzly bears back to California. But small problem with what a lot of people, some advocates may say is like, oh, we'll just take the grizzly bears and put them all in the Sierra Nevada. Nobody lives there. Well,
Mm-hmm.
there's two problems with that. A, there are in fact, people who live there. B, grizzly bears never lived in the Sierra Nevada of California. Do you know where
Right.
California grizzly bears lived?
Where all the people live right now.
Yep, all
Yeah.
along the California coast.
Of course. Yeah.
So it's one of those things that, and you see how, we, like, the state of California struggles with whether you're talking about black bears, or you're talking about mountain lions, or as wolves have begun to recolonize the state. You often wonder, like, could, given these challenges that we see, would be bringing grizzlies into the mix, because there's a massive difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear,
Mm-hmm.
and in terms of what's a threat to people and what's a threat to livelihood.
Yeah.
So, and again, I just give that example as just uh, what happens when certain parties or stakeholders may feel when people are gung ho about let's reintroduce, let's bring it back to the table, but aren't necessarily the people who would have to bear the consequences of that animal being put back onto the landscape. So
Right. There's so many factors to take into account. And like you said, this is these people's livelihood, right? And I mean, this in the States is one thing as well. And then, I've done a little bit of work with some people doing wildlife conflict stuff in Esmeraldas in Ecuador here in the jungle where, these people like 3 chickens will destroy their entire month if an ocelot gets them. So, it's not there's no insurance, there's nothing to help them out. So people need the resources and they need the help and they need training, and it all takes a lot of resource from somebody, and the government
it
may be able
takes
to a little bit.
it
Right.
takes investment of some kind of shape or
Yeah.
form, and whether that's a financial investment or delivery of like anti depredation measures or hazing. Those
Hmm.
are the steps that you can do to help facilitate good blood and making sure people aren't taking matters into their own hands because they feel
Yeah.
like they have to take
Yeah.
matters into their own hands.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a long road, and I mean, I think you're totally right. Some scenarios just completely aren't realistic because we live in a different world now, but I think that's where it's important where, scientists and conservationists and NGOs are working together to see where our efforts and our resources should be going to make a difference, instead of, yeah, these kind of romantic ideas of like, well, we can have bears there, but bears were never there. Well, okay, let's try, putting some more resources into things that aren't extirpated, or to helping grizzly bears where they're still doing okay and still thriving instead.
And to me, again, and so much of, I think everyone really looks to the Yellowstone as the
Mhm.
kind of like idealistic dream,
Yeah.
as opposed to, carnivores, of course, their presence in ecological cascades is always important, whether you're looking at sea otters or you're looking at jaguars or you're looking at wolves. But it's more, I think people often lose sight of the system, and
Mhm.
they get lost up of, oh, it's all about this species and this will do this and this will do this. But it only works if everything else that goes with it is also stable. I mean, whether
Right.
you're looking at, I mean, I think about this all the time, and I'm a carnivore guy, but I greatly admire and appreciate entomologists because that is the foundation of, most ecosystems, and
Right.
how we understand how basically nutrients flow up to the great predators that everyone knows and loves, but it also always begins at really small primary, producers and consumers. And
Mhm.
so, but I think so often, again, people get wrapped up in those charismatic mammals that are
Mhm.
iconic to people, but don't necessarily think about, okay, what does a monarch butterfly have to offer to the system? What does
Yeah.
X, Y, or Z pollinator really bring to the fold when you know it brings everything?
Right.
That is the building blocks of, we talk about watching, wolves go after an elk or a deer. It begins with the small things eventually growing, at least in terms of nutrients and what different species we're talking about. It all begins small and just extrapolates big, and if you don't take care of the small stuff, it's only going to have negative repercussions up the chain.
Right. Yeah. Like, are you reintroducing these big animals literally to have them starve to death because the rest of the system isn't there to support them, and on and so forth? Yeah.
100%.
Hmm.
And then that's the thing,
Yeah.
and even in California, you look at the bears of Tahoe, and it's, you know, the bears out there get supersized,
Yeah.
because they've adapted to eating trash.
Hmm.
They're not, your regular. They're not your regular black bear that you find in a lot of
Yeah.
the U.S. because it is insanely rare to see. Oh my God, it's a 600-pound female black bear.
Right.
So it
Yeah.
becomes another one of those things like, do we want to potentially introduce a carnivore that something like an omnivore like a grizzly to an environment that it just becomes an even bigger trash bear,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
it's living a lifestyle.
As a quick aside, there's a guest coming up pretty soon to talk to me about the Tahoe Bears, so stay tuned
Oh,
for that,
okay.
everyone. Yeah, no, it's okay. Don't worry. It's gonna
Don't
be
want to spill
exciting.
the beans on Tahoe, but
Right. Well, Aidan, you have so much interesting work. I definitely want to encourage people. We didn't quite get into ocelots, but like maybe we can come back for that another time. But people can check out in the show notes. I am gonna link a really cool article that from Nat Geo that you were featured in, which is like definitely goals for a lot of us scientists out there. That they can check out. You have a really great you have a great ResearchGate profile for people to take a look at, and an Instagram too. Um, Before I wrap up, I always like to ask a bit of a dumb question because it's fun. Which wild cat has the best toe beans out of all the wild cats?
oh, that's tough. Well, again, that's the thing. I'm biased though because
Yeah,
I've only seen only a handful in person. But I have to be honest. Ocelots have really awesome toe beans.
I can imagine.
So part of the allure with them is, do you know where the word ocelot comes from?
I do not.
It comes from a Nahuatl word uh, that refers to the ocelotl, which were the elite warriors of the Aztec Empire. And so
Oh,
when
okay.
the Spanish eventually came over, and the indigenous would say, "Oh, ocelotl," and point out the ocelot, they were referring to the jaguar warriors that were came with that label ocelotl. And
Mm,
so, over the years, as Spanish became more prevalent throughout South America and Southern North America, they also gained the nickname of Manny Gordo,
okay.
fat paw. So
Aw.
they have a really wide paw spread, and if you compare that to a bobcat's paw spread, it's very different.
Okay.
So yeah, no, I they're soft, they're adorable, and I am loyal to ocelots because I worked with them a great deal when I was in Texas too.
That's amazing. That's so cool. Thank you for the answer. And we will all Google some ocelot toe beans now because I'm sure they're so great. Well, Aidan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Aidan has a bunch of great stuff to check out. His Instagram is also like your story is always like this amazing place for ecological news. Like I just like go there and like what's new in ecology? Aidan has it on his story. So follow this guy. He knows what's up.
I try to keep it a fun mix on my story, but I'm glad that you appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean there's a little bit of artsy stuff in there sometimes too, but I get a bunch of news from just following you, so that's great.
Well, thank you for following.
Wow, excellent. Yeah, check everything out with the links in the show notes, and maybe I'll have you back soon with your future projects because everybody always likes a sequel. And for everybody else, we'll see you next time.
Thanks again.
Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of the episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you head to the show notes, check out the links of things I might have mentioned in the show, go follow us on social media, and yes, do @ me. I'd love to hear from you, what you think, if you want to be a guest with me, if you have suggestions for future episodes, that would be great. Other than that, we do have a Patreon link as well below if you're feeling like helping support the show, and I can't wait to see you around for next episode. Thanks, bye.